gospel paints a picture of the shepherd and the sheep sharing such sweet intimacy with each other. And that intimacy, that closeness that exists between the shepherd and the sheep rests in the voice of the shepherd. Indeed, in first century Jewish practices, shepherding, you didn't have sheepdogs. You didn't have shock collars or electrical collars. You just had the shepherd's voice to call and guide the sheep. The shepherd certainly had a staff, a rod, but that was mostly for whacking wolves. It wasn't a great comfort to the sheep. What the shepherd used to guide and care for the sheep was the shepherd's voice. And that image is really displayed if we take John's gospel and go just a few verses back. Our gospel reading started at verse 11, but if we start at verse 3, the gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. And then that image of the voice, the shepherd's voice, leading and guiding the sheep, is brought back in the passage we did read, where it says, "I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice." Indeed, the shepherd in first century Jewish practices, the shepherd was a member of the family. That is, the family that owned the sheepfold. Because you see, the sheep didn't just come out of nowhere, right? They didn't just pop into existence. There was a whole sheepfold that the dad, the father in the relationship, in the family had. And then that sheepfold, that flock, got passed down from the father to his son. Now, sheep only live about 10 or 12 years. So they maybe weren't the exact same sheep going from father to son. You get what I'm saying? But it was the same sheepfold, right? And so that sheepfold is passed down from generation to generation within a family. Sheep, as any livestock, would be quite valuable, would provide a livelihood, would provide clothing and warmth with their wool. And so that sheepfold didn't just spring out of nowhere, but was something that was held in the family generation after generation, being passed from the father to the son. And indeed, in Jewish practices, that passing down would be from the father to the youngest son. That is, as each son got older and sort of outgrew being the shepherd, they would take on some other line in the family business, and it would pass on to the youngest son. That's why in that story about David, when Samuel, I think that's his name, Samuel comes and he's trying to anoint the new king of Israel, and he comes to David's family and he's like, "Let me see all your sons," and he parades them all out and he goes, "No, no, 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 do you have any more?" "Well, yeah, I got this little runt, this youngest one, but he's out tending the sheep." And Samuel says, "Summon him." Right, and so the shepherd is a member of the family who owns the sheep, and is the youngest son typically, and so it's the boy who grew up alongside those sheep that are 10 or 12 years old. That boy would have played with them as lambs, seen them grown older, and then in their maturity be their shepherd. As that process unfolded, as the boy grew and the sheep grew, they would know one another intimately. They would know each other personally. Those sheep would know the voice of the shepherd. And it was that voice that the shepherd used to guide and lead the sheep out of the sheepfold into green pastures, and would call those sheep home to the sheepfold when the day was done. It was the voice of the shepherd that bore this deep knowing, what John's gospel says, the sheep know me and I know the sheep. That relationship, that knowing, is born and carried by the voice of the shepherd. And so, when I think on and meditate upon this passage, the question when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, my sheep know my voice and follow me, the question is then, how do you and how do I know that voice? Here we are, 2,000 years later. How do we know that voice? As Episcopalians, most of you don't use the metaphorical language of actually hearing a voice in your head. Some of you do. You're doing great out there, and I'm very glad you're here. But the rest of us, most Episcopalians, don't use that kind of language about hearing a voice from God. And so, what does it mean? What does it look like for the rest of us to know and hear that voice, the voice of the shepherd? Well, the gospel reading gives us a couple of clues. The gospel reading starts with this clue that the voice of the shepherd is a voice that comes between you and the wolf. Now, the wolf comes to scatter and devour you. Hopefully you don't have anyone trying to actively devour you. But I certainly have things in my life that like to scatter me, like my anxiety, which you might have noticed I run on. But there are the fears and the anxieties of the world that can scatter my energies, cause me to just be befuddled. And then there is plenty in this world, in the pain of it, in the grief of the state of it, in the trials and the tribulations and the hardships of life that threaten to devour me, that I think threaten to devour you, that when they become so big and hard, our hope and trust, our excitement and our joy is threatened to be consumed by the great maw, the great mouth of despair. There are indeed wolves in your life and in my life that threaten to scatter and devour us. But there is a voice that places itself between the wolf and you. Another hint that the gospel readings give us is that this voice is completely dedicated to you. There's that word that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And that phrase, lays down, is one Greek word. It's a singular Greek word, not two. And that one Greek word absolutely means to lay down. Totally. That is a valid and probably the correct translation given some of the other literary context of the passage. But it also means a couple of other things. It means to set upon, to appoint, to place, to make one's foundation, to commit oneself to. And indeed, when I was meditating and reflecting on this Good Shepherd imagery and on this passage, I get this, especially once you read all of John chapter 10. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. But if you read all of John chapter 10, you get this image of the shepherd being totally committed to you, being completely dedicated to you. And so I wonder, in your life, what is that voice that sets itself between you and the wolf? I wonder, in your life, what is that voice that is completely dedicated to you. We get in other parts of the Gospels this notion that the shepherd knows the sheep so intimately and so well that even when only just one wanders off and falls down a valley and gets all tangled up in the brambles, that this good shepherd leaves the other 99 to go and find the one lost sheep. Indeed, this good shepherd, this voice of the shepherd, is completely dedicated to you. And I wonder what that voice is, whose voice it is in your life, that when things get hard and you've fallen down into the ravine and you're stuck in the brambles, whose voice it is. That no matter how dark the valley gets, it never leaves you. It never abandons you. It never gives up on you, but is in fact completely dedicated to you. Last clue we get is that this voice of the shepherd leads the sheep, this is most clearly done in the psalm, but leads the sheep to the pasture, to where there is grass, to where there is nourishment, and then calls the sheep back home at the end of the day where it is safe and there is rest. And so I wonder, what is the voice in your life that calls you to nourishment and being fed, that brings you back to the place of safety and rest? For some of you, that voice has been the voice of maybe a good therapist or a good priest. Not me, a good priest. But a good priest, that joke killed at 9. A good priest, right? Maybe that voice is the voice of your grandmother or your grandfather, your dad or your mom. That person who you could call no matter how hard life got and no matter how much trouble you got yourself in. And even if they didn't quite have any wise words to say, the sound of their voice, the words that did come, let you know that no matter how hard it got, it would be okay. That you were still loved and cared for, and that you were not alone. Perhaps for some of you, it's not a voice at all. Instead, it is that quiet thought that lives in your head that says, I can keep doing this. That there is something that moves you and keeps you putting one foot in front of the other. It's that thought or that voice that says, there is more to life than this, that I can do this, that there is hope. Perhaps for some of you, it isn't a voice at all, but it is in fact your own beating heart, your own lungs that fill the body you live in, that keeps you, that breath that animates you and keeps moving you forward one step at a time. I wonder for you, and I invite you to ponder in your life, what has been, what is this voice? This voice that puts itself between you and the wolf, this voice that is completely dedicated to you no matter how dark and hard it gets, this voice that does indeed lead you to the green pastures and back home to the sheepfold. And I wonder, if you don't know that voice, what would help you find it? Because you see, that voice of the Good Shepherd, if you listen and follow, as Psalm 23 tells us, shall lead you indeed to the green pastures, to the still waters, through the darkest valley, and out to the other side where there is a banquet feast prepared for you. where your cup overflows, oil pours down upon your head. Indeed, my friends, no matter how hard and difficult life becomes, no matter what challenges we face, no matter the difficulty of life, what voice can carry you through even that to lead you to life that is known as love, life that is known as everlasting, life that is abundant and full?